Hello and welcome to another episode of Capital Corner. This is Nick Murray, policy analyst at Maine Policy Institute. I'm joined by my colleague, Jacob Posik, director of communications here at Maine Policy, to break down what's happened in Maine politics and public policy for you all in the last week. There's a lot that's gone on. Today, Jake and I are going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about the news on the budget, the state's biennial budget. We're going to talk about the latest fate on the vehicle inspections reform bills that happened this past week. And we're going to talk about the upcoming hearing on bills to reform Maine's emergency powers law. So first off, we heard the news on Monday that House Democrats and Governor Mills are going to push what's known as a majority budget, which would only require a majority vote versus an emergency preamble budget, which is usually how these things go. There's only so many that have happened via majority in the last few decades. Usually legislators, they need 2/3 vote to pass a budget because it happens at the end of the session, and the fiscal year has to start in July 1st. So the legislature has to pass a bill, not with the usual 90-day enactment period. For majority legislation, they want to pass it as an emergency bill to get that budget enacted as quickly as possible. So that deadline is this next week. And so, as I mentioned, House Democrats have put forward a majority budget proposal they call Back to Basics. The legislature is set to convene next Tuesday, April 1st, to deal with this budget. The interesting thing about this is if the legislature goes and passes this majority budget on the final day, that it is even possible to do so, they must adjourn for the end of this year and can only come back into session with a special session that would be declared by the governor, or they would be polling the members to come back. So we're in an interesting case, Jake, and it's an interesting period in history that we're witnessing here in Maine. But if you could give us a little bit of a breakdown on what's in the budget, what should we look for, and what's changed in the last week?
Yeah, so it is slightly pared down from the original proposal that Governor Mills submitted to the legislature earlier this year. It comes in at 8.33 million in its current form anyway. It was a little larger than that at first. That's because it included a new tax. It would have placed a 6% tax on digital streaming services in the state of Maine. That was anticipated to bring in about $10 million in new revenue. We put up a big stink about that. I was following up with newspapers across the state, trying to get corrections on, the truth about what was in the first iteration of this proposal. It contained a $10 million tax increase, which is unjustifiable, really, when you consider the fact that the state of Maine is about to get $1 billion from the feds as part of the American Rescue Plan passed a few weeks ago by Congress. So once those newspapers started printing the corrections and saying that this budget, this quote unquote back to basics budget, included a tax increase, that specific provision was stripped pretty quick. When they held the work session on the bill yesterday in the Appropriations and Financial Affairs Committee, that specific tax was stripped from the proposal. So fortunately, if the Democrats do move forward with this quote unquote back to basics majority budget, potentially, depending on what happens on Tuesday, at least Mainers will not be subjected to this new tax. So a small win, if you will, this week, Nick.
Hey, that's what we do, Jake. You're holding them accountable, holding the media accountable, because they can't say that we're looking at a flat budget that doesn't increase taxes when it does in fact increase taxes on everyone who pays for digital subscription streaming services, Netflix, Spotify, Amazon Prime, all of these things. I think in 2020, or 2021, that's what a lot of folks are using for entertainment today. So couldn't ignore that tax, and I'm glad that we applied enough pressure to get that out of there. That's what we do. We're looking out for Mainers' pocketbooks and making sure that taxes aren't going up when the state is getting billions more dollars to handle the next couple of years. And so, like you mentioned, Jake, we're looking at an $8.33 billion budget over the next 2 years. It's only about 50 million less than what Governor Mills had proposed, but we're being told it's bare bones, it's back to basics. And so this is where we are today. Jake, could we jump to vehicle inspections? What could you break down what happened and where we are? I know the Press Herald that you'd mentioned, the editorial board came out in favor of getting rid of vehicle inspections this year, which is huge. But did the bills follow that fate?
Yeah, this is an issue that we have been advocating for at Maine Policy Institute for years and years and years. And this is the first year I would say it seems like momentum is moving in the right direction. As you mentioned, the Press Herald published that editorial board, and what essentially the argument they made there, which is a very good one, is eventually the people who conduct these inspections need more than just anecdotes to justify the existence of this program. As you look across the country, states are getting rid of these, and when they do, they're not seeing more accidents and more crashes, more deaths, nothing like that on their roadways. So I think it's imperative that we follow the data and stick to what the data says. There were a flurry of bills in the Transportation Committee. They held a public hearing last week. These bills would have either repealed the program entirely or enacted a couple different types of reforms. One would have required new vehicles wouldn't need to be inspected. Others would move to a biennial inspection program. Most of those bills were killed. The committee brokered a deal, essentially. They voted unanimously, ought not to pass on all of those bills, with the exception of one, LD 284, which was Representative Rich Seabra's bill. That bill is still alive. It has been tabled. And what the committee decided to do was create a subcommittee, and that subcommittee has been tasked with determining the parameters of a future study into the merits of the inspection requirement itself. If inspection requirement is necessary, part two of the study would be at what intervals are Mainers required to go get that inspection? Would it be an annual system, a biennial system, or perhaps you would devise a system where newer vehicles don't need to be inspected, and then once they're a certain number of years old, then they would require an inspection. And so Rich Sebra actually had a great quote yesterday during that subcommittee meeting. He said, "It's our job to find out what the full committee is going to do, and that's why government works so well, because it's our job, it's our work to determine what somebody else's work is going to be in the future." So I thought that was funny. That's what that subcommittee is up to. They met yesterday. They're putting together agendas. They're going to be meeting over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks. So what I would say, Nick, is that I don't think it's likely that we're going to get some sort of action as it relates to reforming the system this session. However, I do think the legislature will likely launch some sort of study into the merits of the overall program. And while I'm never a fan of creating blue ribbon commissions or anything like that, you and I have both seen the data on vehicle inspection programs across the country. So I'm excited really to have a deep dive into this, because we know what the data shows. So looking forward to it. Good progress this session.
Absolutely. It feels like we're making progress for the first year in a while with this. And like you said, even though we have all this data and we've been talking about it for years, we actually have decades of data that we review in our latest report published on this issue. You folks can find that at mainepolicy.org. Even with all that data, even with all of this this logic behind us, you can still see that the bill to make some reform becomes a study of the program, and so we need more data. And so that's, like you said, that's how government works. So but let's move to one of our biggest priorities of the legislative session, and that is reforming Maine's emergency powers law. We released a big report a couple months back where we surveyed all 50 states' emergency powers law. We scored them all on a basis of how friendly to liberty are they, how well do they balance power between the executive and the legislative branch. We found that Maine landed somewhere in the middle. We weren't the worst, but we certainly weren't the best. And so in that time, we've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of legislators on putting out reforms. And I'm proud to say that there are 14 bills being heard this Monday at 10 a.m. For the State and Local Government Committee to reform emergency powers. And they span all sorts of different reforms that we've mentioned before. Part of that is reforming the process by which emergencies are declared and extended and terminated. Today, the governor can redeclare a state of emergency that she first declares every 30 days. And so the only safeguard against that emergency essentially continuing in perpetuity is that the legislature can step in and enact a joint resolution, meaning they pass with a majority in both houses to terminate it. So now the legislature can only step in and terminate. A lot of these bills would sort of flip that script so that the governor would have to come back to the legislature every 30 days, and some have 14, some are 7 days, but she'd have a certain amount of time where she would be able to, unilaterally govern in an imminent crisis and react quickly. But then after that, she'd need to go back and get legislative approval to extend the emergency versus being able to redeclare it. And then the legislature would just step in if they want it to end. So there's a lot of great bills there. A couple that I really like. I've worked with Senator Keim on her bills, Senator Lisa Keim out of Oxford County, and she's got a bill that would require any emergency order to be narrowly tailored to fit a compelling public safety interest. And to me, that is so important, because then you won't have a governor or another political official making these orders that can't be held up in court when they infringe on someone's constitutional rights or individual liberty. And when we talk about constitutional rights, we're talking about the First Amendment right to speak, to express oneself, to petition one's government, and to assemble peacefully. And those are some of the most infringed, I think, of this year in the past year. Folks have literally been prohibited from gathering. Folks have been literally prohibited from expressing themselves fully in this scope of a law that we have. So we're looking at a lot of other really interesting ones. There's another one from Dick Bradstreet that would force every emergency order to automatically sunset after 30 days. And that would mean that the state of emergency would have to end when that is terminated as well. So there's that's only a couple of the 14 bills that they're looking at on Monday. And once again, that's this Monday, March 29th at 10 a.m. The state and local government committees hearing this. Folks should go to mainepolicy.org, hover over our issues page, and you'll see the Reforming Emergency Powers form there. Folks can use that to email their legislators and voice their support for all these bills. We want any measure of these bills to pass, because we think that any reform would help give the legislature a co-equal seat at the table, really restore the separation of powers that we have in our constitutional form of government, even in a state of emergency, right, Jake? The legislature has to be there to govern by consensus, and we understand that in a state of a crisis, of an imminent threat, the governor needs the power to be able to step in and manage this. But after that initial period is over, don't you think it's time we get back to consensus? So that's our argument at the committee, and we hope folks will step up and make their voices heard on that. But like I said, that's a big priority this year for us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Nick. I think, 1 year of one person unilaterally ruling the state as it relates to the virus responses is too long, quite frankly. And as you mentioned, you just have to go back to what our documents tell us we have to do. We're supposed to have a separation of powers, and I just think it's wrong that the chief executive has the sole authority to determine whether or not an emergency exists and continues, because obviously she's the one who is able to wield that power if the designation exists. So I think all the bills are great. LD 131, Rep. Kathleen Dillingham's, is probably the most comprehensive in terms of it has a lot of the different reforms that we're advocating for within it. But as you mentioned, I do think there are pieces to some of the other bills that should be added if they are to move forward with some sort of omnibus package. It's time that government worked for the people in this state of Maine. Sure, we're holding public hearings and work sessions on bills all entirely unrelated to the pandemic. But at the end of the day, when your business can potentially be closed or maybe you have to stay home at whim of the order of the governor, I don't think that's really fair. It's certainly not representative government. It's not the system of government that we've used for over 200 years in this state. So really hoping that the state and local government committee will take this issue seriously. We've had a lot of success in this committee in the past. We were able to approve a bill last session through state and local government to require public hearings on ballot initiatives. And so, I know the pandemic is a hypercharged issue for people, but if circumstances are what they appear to be as it relates to what's going to happen with the German and whatnot over the next week or so, if they made these changes and adjourned, they wouldn't really take effect until July 1, and I doubt that that will happen in time, quite frankly, since the public hearing is on Monday. I really don't think they're going to vote on these things until Tuesday. I mean, they're not going to vote on them on Tuesday. So this is going to be something that occurs much later down the road, probably when we're beyond this current emergency, if you will. So, if we're not going to get any immediate changes now, let's just make sure this never happens again in the great state of Maine.
Absolutely. That's what it's got to come back to. It's hard to think that folks in the legislature in the 80s thought that this would be used for a year-long emergency. It's interesting. I spoke with Aaron Chadbourne when he hosted Inside Maine a few months back, I think at this point, and he said that when they went in the LePage administration, they met with MEMA, the Maine Emergency Management Agency, and they said, here are the emergency powers, but be careful when you use them because they're very broad. And so you don't want people just wielding these willy-nilly. And I think we've seen the scope and we've seen the limits of this year. So we're hopeful that folks will stand up, raise their voices on this issue, and we can make some progress. So once again, get to mainepolicy.org, go to our issues tab, and you'll find that form there. We're also posting about this on Facebook and all of that. So Jake, thanks so much for joining me here to talk Capitol Corner. We'll be back with another update soon, I'm sure. But for all you out there, please consider supporting Maine Policy Institute if you want to see a Maine that's vibrant and thriving. Lower taxes, lower regulations are going to bring folks here, and that's why we do what we do. We're holding media accountable, like Jake said, and we're watching all of these bills and making sure that liberty and economic freedom is protected. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you for the next episode of Capitol Corner.